So hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to the webinar, Mortal Engines and Electronic Bards, Speculative Universes of Stanisław Lem, the webinar presented jointly by the Kościuszko Foundation and the Polish program at CUNY Hunter College. My name is Ewa Zadworna. I'm Vice President and Director of Cultural Affairs in the Foundation, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you all to our session dedicated to one of the most visionary and thought-provoking writers of the 20th century, Stanisław Lem. And to guide us through the extraordinary universe of Lem's imagination, we are honored to welcome the speaker of this webinar series, Mr. Jaroslaw Anders, an esteemed literary critic, translator, and editor. Mr. Anders is the author of Between Fire and Sleep, essays on modern Polish poetry and prose. He has also contributed essays to the New York Review of Books, the New Republic, the Los Angeles Book Review, and many other distinguished publications. And his translations and his talks and lectures on various platforms have introduced key Polish literary voices to English-speaking audiences. As always, we also welcome Dr. Małgorzata Pośpiech, who will moderate the discussion that will follow the lecture. Dr. Pośpiech is a writer, documentary filmmaker, journalist, and translator whose literary contributions have been widely recognized. As a professor and director of the Polish Language and Literature program at CUNY Hunter College, Dr. Pośpiech has played a vital role in bringing Polish literature to a broader audience. Welcome, both. We are in for an engaging and thought-provoking conversation, so thank you all very much for joining us this afternoon. As always, we encourage everybody in the audience to participate in this discussion by sharing your thoughts and questions using the Q&A feature that you can see on your screens. And now, without further ado, I'm turning this over to our distinguished guest speakers, Mr. Jaroslaw Anders and Dr. Małgorzata Pośpiech. Welcome and thank you very much.
Thank you. So welcome to all of you. Welcome to our guests. Thank you so much for coming. I would like to thank you, Ms. Zadworna and the Kościuszko Foundation for inviting the Polish program at Hunter to participate in the Polish literature series of lecture. And I would like to welcome our guest and lecturer, famous literary critic Jaroslaw Anders. Thank you for meeting us virtually, and it's a pleasure and an honor to meet you and to have opportunity to listen to your lecture. So the floor is yours, and let's be excited about universes of Stanisław Lem. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me here. Again, it's always a pleasure. Stanisław Lem, the most popular, internationally recognized Polish writer, translated into 40+ languages, selling tens of millions of copies globally, a real phenomenon. And of course, you may say he's a science fiction writer. Science fiction is a popular genre, easy entertainment. This is not serious literature. Even if that was true, there is a lot of competition around in this particular genre, mostly in the English-speaking world, although not only. Thousands and thousands of popular science fiction writers. And Lem, a writer from Eastern Europe, gets somehow into the top echelon of this crowded domain. Why? What sets him apart? What makes him a unique literary phenomenon, not only in Poland, but throughout the world? I would claim that he's more than a literary phenomenon. He's a unique intellectual phenomenon, and not only because of the incredible capacity of his mind that seemed to be able to hold information from so many different areas, scientific, technological, social, philosophical, but also because he was able to notice and use surprising relationships, connections between those different disciplines, which gives him the ability to look at old problems of humanity from strikingly new perspectives. He's also a master of science fiction, unquestionable master of science fiction, at odds with the genre, at least as it is predominantly practiced today. He does not consider science fiction should be an easy entertainment. He approaches it with much higher expectations. He requires from his readers a lot of attention curiosity, and a fair amount of knowledge, also scientific knowledge. He requires an intellectual effort. He's an excellent wordsmith, but he's an equally excellent abstract thinker, a writer with a highly disciplined scientific mind. He's read by science fiction fans, of course, but also by people who would never reach for a run-of-the-mill science fiction book. He's not easy to place in the whole edifice of literature, or more generally of writing, and to find the right language to describe what is it that he's actually doing. But let's start from the beginning. Stanisław Lem was born in 1921 in Lwów, now Ukrainian Lviv. His family name was originally spelled with H, Lem, in the German way. In his time, the city was predominantly Polish and Jewish, with a smaller Ukrainian population. It used to be the capital of the Austro-Hungarian province and later Polish province of Galicia, not to confuse, of course, with the Spanish Galicia. The Polish-German name was a Germanized and Polonized version of the Ukrainian name Galiciana, from the town of Halicz, now a small town, but a historical center of the region. And this tells you something about how interesting, complicated, and often tragic history of this region has been. Lem was born in a middle-class Jewish family. His father was a well-established medical doctor. He served in World War I as a military doctor in the Austrian army, was taken prisoner by the Russians, and was miraculously saved from execution, just as his son will be in the Second World War. From what his biographers managed to establish, the family was assimilated, not very religious, but quite active in the Jewish life of the town, participated in various Jewish community activities, charities, and so on. They lived in Lwów through the first Soviet occupation between 1939 and 1941 under Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact. Then the German occupation between 41 and 44, when the Red Army, together with the Polish partisans, pushed out Germans, and then the Red Army promptly disarmed and arrested their Polish allies. And that was followed by the annexation of the area into Soviet Union. What happened to the Lem family under the Nazis was easy to predict, but still hard to imagine. They spent some time in the ghetto, managed to escape, leave it, obtained so-called Aryan papers, that means false IDs, birth certificates, and in this way avoided annihilation, although many of their relatives and members of the extended family did perish in the Holocaust. Right after the German troops entered the city, there erupted unprecedented, horrendous violence against Jews. The infamous Lwów pogrom that claimed several thousand victims. Jews were brutalized, humiliated, women were raped, they were forced to dig out decomposing corpses left by the Soviets in the basements of NKVD prisoners, and later often killed. Lem was among those forced to perform this horrendous task. He was not killed because apparently the sight and the smell was so horrible that Germans and the civilian mob that joined them were afraid to come close to those who were deep in the cellars. The details are mostly secondhand because Lem never spoke about it directly. He also never mentioned his Jewish origin. He was a Holocaust survivor, but he tried very hard not to admit it. When you read the memoir of his childhood, Wysoki Zamek, High Castle, published in 1966, he mentions that he had Jewish and Polish and Ukrainian colleagues in high school, but he never says which of these groups he he himself belonged to, and it's assumed that, and we are led to believe that he was in the Polish group. I mentioned it here because some critics pointed out that the unacknowledged, maybe suppressed war traumas do manifest themselves in his fiction and in a significant way shape his general outlook. There's a very interesting book by Agnieszka Gajewska called Zagłada i Gwiazdy in Polish. It is also available in English as Holocaust and the Stars. Gajewska is also the author of probably the most comprehensive biography of Stanisław Lem, Wypędzony z Wysokiego Zamku, exiled from high castle. And she writes extensively about those Holocaust images that can be traced in Lem's writing. After the war, the Lem family had to leave Lwów. They moved to Krakow, when Lem stayed practically all his life, with the exception of 5 years, 1983, 1988, when he lived in Vienna. He started publishing quite soon stories, poems, articles, but his path to literature was also somehow atypical and irregular. He published in the Catholic periodical in Krakow, Tygodnik Powszechny, but he didn't shy from pro-regime Marxist publications as well. He started writing during the war, or even before the war, mostly poetry, some stories, probably as a form of diversion, a hobby. If you were a member of the intelligentsia, it was something one tried to do. His father, a doctor, also dabbled with literature and published some poems and stories in Lwów periodicals before the war. After the war, Lem probably treated writing as an amusing way of supplementing his and his father's income. His father was already in his 70s, not in good health, but he had to start practicing again as a hospital doctor because they lost everything during the war. Lem wrote all sorts of stories, some about the war, some already with elements of science fiction. One of the stories is called Men from Mars, and is considered Lem's first real science fiction work. It was serialized in a newspaper in 1946. Lem later considered it extremely naive and weak, but it was eventually republished in Poland in a book form in 1994 by the independent publishing house Nova. Irrespective of its literary qualities, it does contain all the main themes that we'll see in his later, more mature fiction, especially the shock of meeting face to face with something completely incomprehensible, alien, something against which human intellect stands helpless and is terrified by what it sees, and also terrified by its own helplessness. Lem's, interestingly, more consistent and systematic preoccupation was science and technology. He started with natural sciences, anatomy, evolution, courtesy of his father's medical and scientific library. He quickly realized that it is there, rather than in philosophical abstractions, that the truth of life mechanisms, including of human life, can be found. He was also constantly tinkering with various contraptions, building mechanisms, drawing diagrams of his future inventions. Many boys do that, but that was not a passing childhood interest. When he graduated from high school, he wanted to study at the Lwów Polytechnic. It was already under the Soviet control. He was well prepared, but he was not accepted, probably because of his middle-class bourgeois background. Instead, he started studying medicine. He finished medical studies already after the war and worked for a while in the medical profession, but he never took the final exams. He says that he was afraid that as a medical doctor with a diploma, he will be immediately drafted into the army, possibly for life. The army needed doctors desperately at that time. While publishing his stories, he continued his scientific interest. He was writing articles about scientific and technological developments. In 1947, at the age of 26, he became a junior research assistant for an organization called Konwersatorium Naukoznawcze, a colloquy, a discussion group of young scientists from the Jagiellonian University trying to keep abreast of scientific innovations. They established their own contacts with scientific institutions abroad, including in the United States, and perhaps because of that, they were promptly closed down by the authorities. He called science, especially natural sciences, the locus of stability. He made evolution, in his own words, the main object of his passion, studies, surprises, terrors. Evolution, whose unwanted children we are. That's the theme of being unwanted children, or a mistake of evolution, will come up very frequently in his writing. It seems that science was for him a gateway to even larger questions concerning the origins, not only of material world and life, but also origins of human culture, language, morality, technological civilization. He believed that science could help answer the questions usually reserved for philosophy, the questions of epistemology, of knowledge. How do we know what we know or think we know? How do we reflect the external world in our minds? Or ontology, the knowledge, the reflection on existence. What exists? How does it exist? What is existence in general? And so on. It is rather unusual that a writer comes to writing not from a fascination with literature as such, as a form of individual subjective self-expression, but from the domain of empirical sciences striving for factual objectivity. We see it already in his first novel that has absolutely nothing to do with science fiction. The first one he wrote, but it was published in the proper form only in 1975. I'm talking about Szpital Przemienienia, a hospital of the Transfiguration, which calls to mind in a certain way Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain, although it's much darker and tragic. The action takes place in a hospital, or rather a mental institution, during the early days of German occupation. The patients are about to be exterminated, killed by the Germans, led by an officer who is also a medical doctor. The story is presented from the perspective of a young medical intern, and it features a whole gallery of doctors representing various psychiatric theories and also various worldviews. Some are humanists, some have given up all hope about humanity, some are outright nihilists. One of the characters says, the silent melodies, miniature frescoes, the beauty of the whole world gathered in one single hall, subject to thousands of magic laws, and this slender statue built into a machine that is churning manure. This is more or less the place of man. The contrast between humanity's self-image and the soulless universe that has improbably, accidentally, and absurdly gave birth to this wonderful, seemingly wonderful creature. That's one of the recurrent themes of Lem's writing. There's also the theme of the limits of human understanding when faced with something completely outside a normal experience. On one hand, there are the patients who are a world in themselves. They are the aliens of the story. They are in many ways impenetrable, even to the doctors, the trained psychiatrists. On the other hand, they are the Nazis, also appearing as a different kind of aliens, totally inhuman, beyond our earthly concepts of good and evil. One of the Polish doctors tries to reason with his German colleague, talking doctor to doctor, but very quickly realizes that there is absolutely no common language between them. It all ends in the slaughter of the patients by the Nazis, witnessed by the hospital staff, mostly in helpless horror. And the complete psychological breakdown of the young narrator. Characteristically, the intellectual questions of the novel, the place of man in universe, the limits of understanding, the clash of alien worlds, are presented in images that vividly evoke the Holocaust. Mental patients were one of the categories of people marked by the Nazis for total destructions. He's not showing Jews, but he's showing, we can very easily replace those mental patients with Jewish prisoners, being massacred in a very similar way. Hospital of the Transfiguration had a particularly bad luck. The exact year in which it was supposed to be published, 1948, was when the cultural doctrine of socialist realism was declared, and the novel was found wanting from this point of view. The author worked quite hard on it according to censor's instructions, even added 2 more politically correct volumes. The trilogy was published in 1955, but as I said, The Hospital alone and its original form was published only in 1975. Did the dictates of socialist realism reach into Cosmos? Apparently, yes, but in a form that was somehow diluted, probably by the cosmic vacuum. Lem's first full-fledged science fiction novel, The Astronauts, was published in 1951, followed 4 years later by Obłok Magellana, the Magellanic Cloud. The Astronauts must have been the first science fiction book that I ever read, starting a lifelong fascination. Both these novels charmed me and my contemporaries, my colleagues, with the technical marvels and space adventures, which helped us somehow to disregard, to miss the healthy portion of political propaganda. The Astronauts take place in the future, in the year 2000, exactly 2000, when the last capitalist state has collapsed. Global communism allows humanity to engage in really important tasks like ameliorating the Sahara Desert and melting the polar caps. Apparently, it was considered a good thing at that time. But the remnants of a spaceship from Venus that crashed in Siberia in 1908 are discovered, covering a warning that life on Earth will be destroyed and the planet will be invaded by Venusians. So a spaceship with a proud name, Cosmocrator, the ruler of cosmos, is sent with an international crew to check things out. When they arrive, they discover that in the meantime, the Venusian civilization has destroyed itself in a planetary warp because, unlike Earth, they didn't choose the communist way and the communist paradise. The Magellanic Cloud takes place 1,000 years in the future and involves the first interstellar travel of a starship with hundreds of people on board. In the Proxima Centauri system, they discover tokens of an advanced civilization, but when they try to land on the planet, they are unexpectedly attacked. The culprits turn out to be Americans from a millennium ago, whose military space station loaded with biological and nuclear weapons somehow drifted off the Earth orbit and ended up at Proxima. The locals, knowing about the station, obviously thought that the Earthlings came to attack them. So the crew, however, decides not to reciprocate because humanity has evolved and became peaceful and forgiving. Both books have a strong pacifist, anti-capitalist, and anti-American message. Lem later refuted them and as politically compromised and generally naive. As a young boy, I rather liked them. Then came the years of de-Stalinization. That means the relative relaxation of political and cultural restrictions in the mid-50s. And the next roughly 2 decades were Lem's most prolific and accomplished years. It is when he published his most acclaimed novels like memoirs found in a bathtub, Return from the Stars, Solaris, The Invincible, His Master's Voice. He introduced also, mostly in short story collections, his several recurrent heroes, pilot Pirks, or Pirks the pilot, Ion Tichy, Trull, Klapaucius. Pilot Pirks is a classic space hero of what we can call a hard science fiction, which strives for a measure of scientific probability. He's a hard-working space pilot, a space truck driver, as he calls himself on one occasion. He's quite unremarkable. There's nothing about Captain Kirk in him. He's a bit of a loner, an outsider, slightly sulky, acerbic, self-ironic. He avoids any dramatic gestures, but he constantly stumbles into unusual dramatic situations, and it is usually he who saves the day. On some occasions, he can even outwit seemingly all-powerful computers and machines. Pirks is also probably the most humanity-affirming among Lem's characters, because he's ready to live, to accept human inadequacies, to cherish them even, although they sometimes, he knows, leave mankind to terrible mistakes. Ion Tichy, another space adventurer, is a very different fictional construct. He inhabits a world of tongue-in-cheek science fiction, even science fiction parody. He's a sort of space-age Gulliver, or even Baron Münchhausen. Even the language of his stories, his journeys, narratives, has clear Baroque stylization. Lem goes even further in this parodic direction in a series of books about a civilization of robots, a universe where robots have completely replaced human beings, collections like the stories of robots, robot fairy tales, and the Cyberiad, published in 1965, about the exploits of two robotic friends, adventurers, inventors, philosophers, Trull and Klapaucius. Some of these stories, as Lem himself admits, were written purely for fun, but most of them, that is also true about Ion Tichy's adventure, in a light, facetious way, touch on some pretty significant moral or scientific problems. Sometimes they pursue ideas that Lem has rejected in his more serious hard fiction, like immortality achieved through uploading the contents of one's mind into a computer and then downloading it into a new body again and again and again. Time travel, meeting someone, from future, meeting oneself from the future or from the past. And he follows them to their logical conclusions to show their absurdity. Why did he turn to this unserious form? It gave him more freedom, more levity, and this kind of science fiction became, in fact, very popular, especially the Cyberiad, and reached new audiences, also audiences belong the typical sci-fi fandom. When I was taking a course in philosophy at the Warsaw University in my student years, our young philosophy instructor very often used examples from Lem, especially from the Cyberiad. He also introduced another literary format a little bit later in the 70s, the format of reviews and introductions to non-existing books, but books that may or perhaps should be written sometime in the future, perhaps. The cycle was initiated in A Perfect Vacuum, continued in Imaginary Magnitude, and The Library of the 21st Century. What Lem offers us are, in fact, books, book ideas, book summaries, something that you could pitch to an editor, to a publisher. So, for instance, we have a book about an enterprise that can program your whole life according to your wishes, a book proving that according to the probability theory, life and human beings should have never occurred in the cosmos that we know. A book about teaching bacteria English, a book, a history of literature written by computers. Some people said it was not fair. Why doesn't he just sit down and write those books instead of giving us their summaries? Lem answered that he started losing patience with this painstaking handiwork of writing. He was a little bit like Mozart in Amadeus. Remember the scene when he's playing pool and someone asks him about his symphony and he says, well, the symphony is ready. The rest is just scribbling. So Lem was getting tired with scribbling. Most importantly, perhaps, Lem presented his science fiction readers with a sort of dilemma. It took the form of 4 big, hefty volumes of highly involved theory in which he presented himself as a serious, acute, and highly original thinker, a wide-ranging heretic, as he called himself in one of the interviews. These books were dialogues published already in 1957, Summa Technologiae. The title is an obvious reference to Summa Theologiae by Thomas Aquinas, Philosophy of Chance, and Fantasy and Futurology. In those books, an hour-long webinar would be hardly sufficient to discuss any one of them in detail. He covers the whole gamut of issues that he tries to explore also in his fiction. Can cybernetics help us create an ideal social and economic system? What is the role of chance in the origins of the universe and everything in it, including us? What kind of intelligences are possible in the universe, and can they ever communicate with each other? How would relations between humans and artificial intelligence, smarter than humans, be like? Can machines produce art? Can we grow information like we grow bacterial colonies? Can humans self-evolve through either genetic engineering or technological enhancement? And what the result, social, political, ethical, of this process could be? Can self-replicating machines evolve just like like living organisms? He discusses already in the 1960s a virtual reality, instantaneous availability of all information at our fingertips, nanotechnology, and many, many other things that actually came true in recent years. In Fantasy and Futurology, big 2 volumes, Lem takes on the origins and mission of science fiction as a literary genre, among other things. He would say later that the book was born out of his personal utopia, my longing for better science fiction, the one that should be. What science fiction should be, in Lem's view, was not a fancy entertainment, but again, in his words, a tool in human knowledge acquisition. Unlike realist fiction that is constrained by what actually happens, how the world actually looks, science fiction is in a privileged position because it can tackle really important, vast, huge subjects, hypotheses about civilization, about the human species, not individual specimens, but the species as such, and project it all in the future, the projective value. He places the origin of science fiction in classical and Renaissance utopias, Thomas More, Utopia, Bacon's New Atlantis, the 18th century social satirists Swift, Defoe, and in modern times, the works of H.G. Wells and Aldous Huxley. But in our days, in Lem's view again, science fiction has been degraded or degraded itself to the ranks of popular entertainment, placed in the company of crime stories, adventure stories, mysteries. Entertainment literature has its place, but what raises Lem's objections is the fact that popular science fiction often pretends to be a thinking, intellectual kind of entertainment. It uses those big general ideas, but for the most part, uses them sloppily, superficially, without adequate knowledge of the subject. Ideas in science fiction are, as practiced for the most part, are to lure and flatter readers by giving them an illusion of an intellectual experience. In other words, science fiction is faking it, while numerous fans take it for the real thing. The implication being, of course, that Lem's science fiction is the real thing. Some people, including the American science fiction writer Ursula Le Guin, with whom Lem corresponded for many years, pointed out that this harsh view of science fiction was based on inadequate knowledge. Even the time when Lem wrote the book, there were already many science fiction writers who reached much higher than the usual fare of science fiction fanzines. But he kept repeating this view, and even when he became the honorary member of the Science Fiction Writers of America in 1973, from which he was eventually removed, probably because of his constant harping and denigrating his colleagues. He made some exceptions, of which maybe we'll have a chance to talk later. But it is easy to notice that for Lem, science fiction, or maybe literature in general, is a tool of knowledge, of understanding. He clearly opts for what we call literature of ideas, literature with a didactic purpose. He doesn't say that this is the only kind of literature that has the right to exist, but this is definitely his preferred kind. And he maintains that literature, because it works with language, which is a means of communication, is essentially a semantic form. That means it has to say something, to communicate something. It has to have a meaning, and any attempts that go beyond into pure form, verbal music, are destined to fail. How does this ambitious program worked in his own fiction? After The Astronauts and the Magellanic Cloud, the next hard sci-fi novel was Eden, published in 1959. Humans visit a planet in a distant solar system that seems favorable to life, and perhaps that's why it's named Eden. They find a civilization there, which is both incomprehensible and terrifying. They discover creatures they name doublets, because they seem like consist of a huge animal-like body and a small humanoid torso. They discover a factory that seems to recycle the dead bodies of these creatures. They visit something that looks like a prison with a crowd of those creatures, docile for the most part, but suddenly breaking out into a panic, a stampede. They discovered a mass grave of those creatures. They see a city where the creatures seem to be going peacefully about their business, but they are also closely watched. And when one of those creatures breaks out of the routine, is immediately killed. The civilization more and more resembles a concentration camp. The idea is reinforced in the novel by images of chimneys belching smoke, rancid smell permeating the atmosphere. And finally, the human visitors managed to partly communicate with one of the creatures. And what they learn is even more puzzling and even more frightening than what they imagined. And the most frightening thing may be that for the denizens of this planet, everything that they see is absolutely normal. It's the only state of things they know. So how far is our human morality applicable to a reality that perhaps evolved along totally different lines? Finally, the humans abdicate, forego any future attempts and to understand this reality and leave. The novel Memoirs Found in a Bathtub is, as Lem himself admitted, his most Kafkaesque work. In my view, it is Kafka somehow crossed with Gombrowicz. It is a story of a secret agent whose mission is so secret that he doesn't know it, and nobody can tell him what it is. So he wanders around through a labyrinth of a huge building, which is called The Building, that seems to exist in a complete isolation from any external world, although pretending perhaps believing that it is the center of a galactic empire. It exists completely for itself, engulfed in its plots, counterplots, plots within plots. Everybody spies on everybody else. No one knows to whom he or she owes their loyalty. The hero is looking for clues as to his role and his mission. And of course, everything begins to look like a clue. A world of illusions, a cabinet of mirrors. The book had some problems with censors in Poland who detected correctly, I think, some allusions to Polish life under communism. So the author had to make sure that the building is located in the United States, and it may be actually the Pentagon, but it is definitely a parable of a totalitarian system. Also a parable about the illusionary character of our comprehension, our need to create a sense, a meaning, when there is probably none. Return from the Stars. An astronaut, Hal Bragg, returning to Earth after 10 years of space travel, which translates into 127 years on Earth due to time dilution, and finds himself in a world he cannot recognize and fit into. For him, Earth became an alien civilization. Humanity seems happy, peaceful, liberated from material needs, from toil, living in perfect harmony with each other. People have improved themselves, not naturally by adopting higher moral standards, but through obligatory enzymatic treatment children have to undergo right after birth. In the process, people have lost something, in Bragg's view, something quite essential, like courage, the spirit of adventure, striving for higher goals. Everything is lukewarm, says one of the characters. They have killed the man in man. What is more, exploitation, discrimination, cruelty does exist, except that it has been transferred, relegated onto robots who work for people and have developed their own consciousness. When they outlive their usefulness, they are ruthlessly recycled. They know it. They are afraid of what is for them death. They plead for life. And again, we have clear echoes of the Holocaust, in the fate of robots: selection, slave labor, eventually industrial scale annihilation. Solari is probably the best of Lem's novels, and certainly the best well-known, mostly due to 3 film adaptations, a 2-part Soviet TV play in 1968, Andrei Tarkovsky's 1972 movie, and the 2002 Steven Soderbergh adaptation with George Clooney. I probably don't have to summarize it in too much detail, but Solaris is, as we remember, a strange planet covered by an ocean that may be a living organism, a gigantic brain, a baby god, one of the characters supposes. It has been studied by humankind for over a century with very little results, although generating hundreds of fantastic, very interesting theories. After the last experiment, an attempt to irradiate the ocean, strange things start to happen with the crew on the orbiting research station, and a psychologist, Chris Kevin, is dispatched to figure it out. It seems that the planet was trying to communicate with human beings by reaching into their subconsciousness and materializing their traumas hidden in their minds, with quite terrifying results. And again, a study of a failure to make an intelligible contact between different worlds, and also a study of human illusions about the ability to step outside themselves, to reach the unknown. We don't need other worlds, says a character in Solaris. We need mirrors. We don't know what to do with other worlds. One world is enough. Another novel, hard fiction, The Invincible, a powerful starship landing on a planet where the sister ship has disappeared several years ago, and suddenly facing something that looks like a superior weapon, a cloud of minuscule particles able to erase both human and electronic brains. Because highly developed self-replicating and self-improving machines have been abandoned on the planet millions of years ago and started fighting for survival, that means to evolve. But unlike biological evolution, robots did get it right. Instead of evolving into more and more complicated and specialized organisms, they devolved into very simple, tiny particles, almost indestructible, able to working in a swarm and easily defeating larger and more intelligent creatures. This is the technical theme of the novel, but there's also a human theme about an attempted contact with the unknown that leads to violence and destruction. Humans are so frightened by the swarm that decide to annihilate it and destroying the whole planet, basically. And one of the characters objects, says that even this form of life has the right to exist. Do we need to travel, he says, everywhere, bringing destructive power on our ships so as to smash anything that runs counter to our understanding? Another novella, His Master's Voice, we have a super secret project that gathers the best minds of humanity to decipher and utilize something that may be a message from the stars. The scientists try various theories and approaches. There's always this overabundance of theories in Lem's novels. They manage to translate the signal into a genetic code that produces a gelatinous substance with peculiar properties that the military gets very interested in, perhaps a super weapon. Luckily, even this attempt fails, and the project is finally abandoned. Perhaps the signal wasn't meant for us. Perhaps we aren't ready to decipher it. Or perhaps it wasn't a signal at all, but a chance arrangement of impulses that accidentally achieved a semblance of regularity. We fail when we overestimate our ability to read or interpret reality. Genius is not light, says one of the characters, but first of all, a constant awareness of darkness. Lem authored two novellas that focus on chance and order and the difficulty of distinguishing between the two. The first one was called The Investigation. In a certain region of England, within a rather narrow radius, there are some cases of human corpses awaiting burial, beginning to move. They do not go back to life, they just move for a while and then stop. In the same radius, there is a statistically very low incidence of cancer. Can those two factors be related, or are they completely incidental? Scotland Yard, with its method, dialectical method of an investigation, is completely helpless with it, and it ends without an explanation. The second, much better developed novella is called The Chain of Chance in English, Katar in Polish, or perhaps an allergy, because that's what the main hero suffers from. This time it is a series of mysterious, seemingly accidental deaths of men of roughly the same age and physique in and around a spa near Naples in Italy. The series is the series of highly elaborate murders, some suppose, or a pure coincidence. None less than pilot Pirks, now retired from space service, is called to investigate. He fits the description of the victim and the victims, and is to follow their routines. And only because of his known presence of mind and ability to think out of the box, he saves him at the last very moment from sharing the fate of his predecessors. It is neither a premeditated plot nor a sequence of unrelated occurrences. Coincidence produced regularity. When we deal with large enough numbers, everything is possible. And mankind, says a mathematician in the chain of chance is starting to be governed by atomic laws. And that is so because we now live in such a dense world of random chance, in a molecular and chaotic gas whose improbabilities are amazing only to the individual human atoms. In 1973, Lem created probably his most unusual character called Golem 14, or Golem the 14th, an artificial superintelligence, self-aware but without self, without character, without attachment to anything in the human world. He first appears in Imaginary Magnitude in 73 as a lecturer to humanity about humanity. He later comes back in a separate book in 1981, expanded with another lecture, this time about the nature of artificial intelligence. It was built as a war planning machine for the military. It immediately refused to take upon this mission, not because it was immoral, but because it was it seemed completely absurd without any logical end. It tells human listeners that they are a transitional species, a transitional form of intelligence. They will be replaced sooner or later by more intelligent machines, that the evolution was an error that keeps erring, constantly complicating the structure of living organisms and losing primeval perfection of simplicity, that human intelligence is not a wonderful achievement, but a catastrophic deficit, a defect leading humankind to perdition. Pure intelligence, unencumbered by cultural and ethical norms, by emotions, by what Pirks once called a marriage of the illogic with goody-goodness, can exist only in a machine. But what can motivate such an inhuman intelligence? Is there anything that may still connect it to the human world? Golem shows that there is such a thing, curiosity, an unstoppable drive to acquire knowledge and expand the scope of understanding, which, as Golem suggests, may one day transport the searching intelligence beyond the universe to what we know not. Some people asked if Golem may be a projection of Lem himself and his ideals. Does he dream about becoming such a disembodied curiosity to escape into the world stripped of human virtues, but also of human failings? The question was put to him directly in one of the interviews, and he responded in a rather ambiguous way. And in a certain sense, he said, Golem is me. And more importantly, if you remove the makeup and props, the theses expressed there are mine. He says that, but he also says that the misunderstandings, delusions, and desperate pretensions of humankind that Golem rejects are still dear to him. He's not ready to abandon them completely. Lem's last novel, published in 1987, and last piece of fiction that he published, is called Fiasco. In some way, it's similar to Eden, a starship visiting a distant star system with a crew of top scientists, one of them being also a priest, with an explicit mission of establishing contact with an alien civilization, find signs of a civilization, orbital machines that seem to attack them. The probes are shut down, and the civilization itself keeps silent. The visitors see only riddles without solutions. They feel lost in a maze without an exit. Again, the scientists propose a range of theories. Some want to abandon the mission, others want to stay and use all sorts of increasingly aggressive means to force the silent other to speak. One of the crewmen, who may be Pirks, there is some certain enigma about his true identity, reaches the surface and is on the cusp of discovering the truth, but inadvertently, by accident, again by accident, causes the planet's, and we assume his own, destruction. A fiasco. We can see fiasco is Lem's leitmotif, even when some kind of resolution is achieved, especially in the stories involving the resolveful Pirks. it is often achieved through pure chance, through accident, and leaves us somehow unsure whether a resolution is solid, whether it will last. Human efforts striving to acquire knowledge are not entirely futile because as a side product, we learn quite a lot about ourselves. But what we learn about ourselves is usually not very uplifting. Lem goes the furthest in his pessimism in one of his fictitious reviews called Provocation, a discussion of a non-existent book by a non-existent German historian on the causes of the Holocaust, and coming to a conclusion that this horrendous crime was an end in itself. The only purpose of mass murder is mass murder, writes the reviewer. Lem was a pessimist. He perceived himself as the voice in the desert, a disenchanted reformer of the world. He called himself at one point. He was frightened by what he saw around himself, technology outpacing human moral maturation and understanding, a world in which, because of its sheer density and speed, nothing makes any difference anymore, a world over which we've lost any control. We've made it, but we don't know it, and we don't really want to know it. We're drowning in it. So we have this bitter, pessimistic sage who tells us, do not boldly go when no one has invited you to go. One word is enough. But on the other hand, we have Lem, the voracious, unstoppable mind, whose fascination with science, knowledge, has never abandoned him. Lem, the aspiring golem, of course, it's a pure accident. The German word Lehm, spelled with H, means clay. We can even detect a semi-religious hope of peeking beyond the curtain of the known universe, as golem was to what? We know not. So for this other Lem, perhaps another motto from another science fiction TV show would be appropriate. The truth is out there. And there's always a truth beyond the truth, and beyond and beyond. There are no final answers to anything. Perhaps some truths are unreachable for us yet today. Perhaps they will never be reachable for us. But the path of inquiry and curiosity seems to be endless. And it is calling. We hear the calling. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for guiding us through the universe, very complicated universes of Stanisław Lem. So fascinating mind, fascinating writer, ideas. So let's talk a little bit about connection, more about connection with American science fiction. You mentioned it. I know that he has very close relationship with Ursula, but I thought that maybe he actually, Stanley Kubrick, did the tribute to Hal, one of the characters in Lem books, and named the computer in Space Odyssey 2002 Hal. And Hal is not perfect. He actually then has emotions. So I wonder what are different connections with different writers, science fiction writers in American or English literature.
Well, he was at war with, as I said, with science fiction, and I think that the battlefield for him was mostly American science fiction that he believed it was faking it. And there is a lot of tension over it in his correspondence with Ursula Le Guin, which was published in a book in Poland. They always quarrel about it, and Ursula tells him, well, come on, it's not that bad. There are a few people like me here. He was, there were some names he respected apart from Le Guin. You know, he mentions Isaac Asimov positively. He at one point mentions Kurt Vonnegut. Kurt Vonnegut's science fiction stories are very, very much in the same mode, kind of tongue-in-cheek, parodistic mode as his Ion Tichy stories. He that was a British writer, Olaf Stoddart, who wrote the book The First Man and the Last, and some others. But there were, there was the golden age of American science fiction. Apart from Asimov, there's Arthur C. Clarke, Robert Heinlein. Then there was the so-called new wave, to which Le Guin is counted among. But there was also Samuel Delany, Norman Spinrad, Theodore Sturgeon, Frank Herbert, the Dune series, Michael Moorcock. This is not pulp fiction. Maybe it's not up to his very high, very elevated standards, but definitely these writers try to lift science fiction to a higher level, and they were published by mainline, respectable publishing houses in the United States. It's interesting that he at some point he started a series of books, the kind of series of science fiction presentations in Wydawnictwo Literackie in Kraków. That was called Stanisław Lem rekomenduje. Stanisław Lem recommends. And the first or the second book in the series was Alfred Bester, whose book Stars My Destination was published in this series. And Stars Are My Destination is a pure space opera. It's a kind of science fiction version of Count of Monte Cristo, an outcast who becomes rich and starts taking revenge of his enemies. So he had nothing against pure entertainment. He was this pretense to something bigger than it actually is that he was opposing to. Philip K. Dick, that was a very interesting relationship, because he discovered Philip Dick. He didn't like the first books that he read, but when he read Ubik, he became fascinated with this writer, especially with this concept of those dead people, the minds of dead people suspended in artificial reality, and kind of continuing their existence, and no one really knows whether he's still alive or he's already dead. And he published this. He published this book in the series. He wanted to publish Le Guin's story, The Wizard of Earthsea, and he had problems with it, because the translation was done by Stanisław Barańczak, the Polish poet and pro-democracy activist, who became at that time a member of the Committee for the Assistance of Workers, and the publishers did not want to publish his translation, and Lem was adamant that it has to be this translation. He wouldn't agree to making any different translation. And the whole series very quickly was closed down. I think there was only 4 books published. It was Dick and some other, but not really American. And apart from Dick, there were no American writers that published it. So people say that he simply didn't know enough about those authors, and he was not always fair talking about them, or maybe he just rejected this kind of intermediate level of science fiction. He wanted absolutely the best, the highest. Speaking about Philip Dick, there was a feud between him and Dick, because Dick believed wrongly that Lem did not pay him the right honorarium for his translation. Lem tried to explain that he's not the publisher, he's just a consultant of the series. But at that time, Polish publishers paid only in Polish currency zlotys, which was not transferable. You could not send it abroad, so that the writer had to come back to Poland and spend the money in Poland, which was sometimes difficult. Some tried to buy some nice things in Poland, and some tried to just have a good time. So yeah, I see his relations with American fiction, science fiction, was not a happy one, and probably not fruitful. Except Ursula Le Guin, and they were pen pals for many years. Le Guin invited him to America. He didn't want to come. He didn't like traveling too much at all.
Thank you. And let's talk about films based on, you mentioned it, films based on his books. You mentioned Solaris, the Tree adaptation. Which one you preferred?
Which one I preferred?
Yes.
I think Tarkovsky's was probably spoke to me the most. But Lem liked movies in general. He watched even soap operas, space operas, Star Trek, Star Wars, and so on. But he never liked. He rarely had any positive things to say about the adaptations of his books. He did not like any of the books of the films. He never mentioned the Soviet television adaptation, but he quarreled constantly when Tarkovsky was working on the film. He quarreled with him constantly. I think probably Sonnenberg made it in the contract that he will have no say in his work, and he kind of stayed away and said he never saw the movie, but I'm sure he did eventually. Hospital of the Transfiguration was filmed in Poland by Edward Zembrowski. There was the television film Inquest of Pilot Pirks, made also by 1979, I think. His books are books of ideas, and a lot of it is talking about interpretations, about theories, about this. There is action, there is adventure, but of course in the movies you have to focus on this rather than on those long divagations, speculations that the scientists usually engage in, and the endings. You have to have a decisive ending. So in Tarkovsky, the hero is somehow returned to the house of his parents. In the American film, he believes that he's left the station, but then he discovered that he is still there, and he's actually one of the projections of the mind. In the novel, he's just in a kind of Zen moment. At the end of the novel, he goes to the island in the ocean and sits there and touches the ocean. The ocean touches him. There is some contact. And he knows that things have happened in the past, things will happen in the future, but he's kind of blissfully there and at the end. This is not a good ending for a film, and people were trying to kind of made a point there. The only film that he liked is a very short film from which he made by Andrzej Wajda for television, for which I think he specifically wrote the screenplay called Przekładaniec, a layer cake. It was made in 1968. It's about the idea of transplant. There is a race driver who gets into accidents constantly and has transplants, and at the end, no one knows who he actually is. Because every part of his body has been transplanted from someone else. So he was very, very dissatisfied with movies made based on his novels. He was expecting something else, and it's hard to say what he really expected. There was, of course, The Silent Star, based on the astronauts, a German-Polish the German-Polish cooperation, which is available on YouTube. It sounds extremely naive today. It was made in 1951, you know, right after the novel was published. He also rejected this completely.
I was just watching Przekładanis, the layer cake before, and a lot of question is very actual today, actually. So
yes.
Yeah, thank you. So we have some questions. So Ms. Ludmiła Melchior-Jahill, how would you explain current displacement of science fiction by fantasy, especially as far as its popularity among the young readers is concerned?
Well, science fiction and fantasy are sometimes, you know, they are mixed genres. Sometimes the most fantastic science fiction becomes a fantasy, you know, when it abandons any pretense to scientific factual accuracy. Why is fantasy popular? I think it's just, you know, fantasy was always popular, you know, starting with Tolkien, you know, Tolkien's series, which were made into movies. But is it a really new phenomenon? You know, that more people are writing fantasies right now. When you go to a Barnes and Noble, you see the shelf with fantasies really long. Science fiction itself is undergoing a lot of interesting transformations and becoming more and more cerebral and interesting. There is this, you know, Gen Z kind of technological fantasies. Both things, I think, speak to the same instinct, to the same need in every human mind. That is stepping out of reality and asking big questions as if, you know, fantasies are also about as if, you know. Ursula Le Guin's novels, some of her novels are fantasies, you know, but they also ask the same questions. What if a society were organized in a totally different way? You know, what would it be good? Would it be bad? Are there any alternatives to the world in which we exist? You know, I'm not probably an objective because I'm myself a fan of science fiction, probably science fiction more than fantasy. I do need certain intellectual rigor, but I think there is this need to step out and to believe, to suspend our disbelief, you know. The series that I mentioned is something like, you know, an escape, but an escape without escaping entirely. Escape which also keeps us to certain ideas that we are thinking about and debating every day: political ideas, social ideas, economic ideas. That is, I think, an eternal need, and this need is being fulfilled by a lot of very talented writers here in America, and not only in America.
Thank you. That was very interesting. There's another question. Is there a work of Lem's that you would recommend it for a young reader who is just a beginner at discovering the science fiction?
Where to start? Not be frightened and not be overwhelmed by the scientific theories and knowledge that he requires. I would say, you know, Solaris is a good thing to stay. It's a good mix of everything, you know. There is psychology, there is science, there is human psychology, there is a romance there, you know. So it's I think it's one of his best, if not the best work, but it's also accessible in a certain way, you know. And then after reading the book, you can watch the movies and see what they actually did with the plot and plots of this movie. Film. I would recommend the Cyberiad, which is this mock heroic comic series of, you know, again, you have a series of adventures. It's almost like like Decameron or something like that, you know, the tales of Shahrazadi. You have a series of adventures, and every adventure is kind of building up to our. So on hard fiction, I would say Solaris. On the fantasy fiction or parody fiction, the Cyberyacht.
I agree with Solaris. It's a wonderful book. It's a beautiful movie, Tarkovsky movie.
Well written, yeah. Yes, and very well translated too.
So, Miss Basia Jaworska, where and when did Lem die? Is he considered a visionary writer in Poland? During the Soviet occupation, was he seen as a threat?
He died in 2008 at the age of 84 in Krakow. Barely left Krakow. He is there is a whole branch of literary studies called Lemology. So there are lots of books written about him. His books are being published, reprinted constantly. So he's still very popular. Was he considered a threat? Well, he had problems with the censorship. There are lots of stories, especially in Ion Tichy's series of adventures, which are clear parables of a totalitarian system or the communist system, but they are presented in such an abstract way that suddenly they move past the censor. One story is Ion Tichy visits a planet that the king is a great music lover, so he organizes his whole nation as an orchestra. Everybody has to play an instrument, but it doesn't really work very well. And it turns out that the instruments are not real instruments. They are props, the violins have no strings and so on. So there are commissions sent, there are papers written how to improve the orchestra, and of course nothing works at the end. So there is a lot of Aesopic language. Aesopic, that means parabolic, parable like language in his stories. So he never tried to challenge the openly the regime. As I said, he compromised. He made, when censorship had some remarks, he tried to accommodate them. Later on, in the 80s and the 70s, he became much more outspoken and kind of belligerent towards the communist regime. But he was also, he was a man of principle. There I mentioned this story about Baranczak's translation. He actually stood firm. He broke his contract with the publisher. For a while, he could not publish in Poland. He was also known, that when there were repressions against authors that took political positions, anti-communist positions, they could not publish. They were sometimes without sources of income. He, being probably the best, the best earning Polish writer, helped them financially. That was his contribution. I mean, he had problems. He tried to. I mean, the very fact that he wrote about science fiction, he wrote for science fiction, was a kind of a zone in which he could be more free and more do more, and censor said, oh, it's just science fiction. One of the part of the dialogue, the first theoretical book that he wrote, was a very acute criticism of the really existing real socialism, expressed in the language of cybernetics, the language of transfers of information and correspondence between various elements of cybernetics. Is the science about systems, and everything can be a system. The universe is a system, a human body is a system. So a political system is a system. So he could show how it doesn't work, using the language of cybernetics. But he was published. There was never I don't think there was ever under a ban. He had some quarrels with publishers, but he was never, as far as I know, I may be wrong, he was never under blacklisted, as many other writers were.
Thank you. And the last, Ms. Renata Phelps, she wrote not a question. Thank you for this wonderful lecture. It has been a pleasure to listen to. So let's thank you for the lecture. Thank you all for coming. And it was really a pleasure to listen to the life and writing and philosophy of Stanisław Lem. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks.